Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. As Jesus was teaching in the temple area, he said, "How do the scribes claim that the Christ is the son of David? David himself, inspired by the Holy Spirit, said, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I place your enemies under your feet.' David himself calls him Lord. So how is he his son?" The great crowd heard this with delight. The Gospel of the Lord. Today is June 9th, which is the feast of St. Ephrem in the church. So who is St. Ephrem? Not to be confused with the Ephraim that we hear about in the Old Testament, right? Ephraim was one of the names that Israel would go by. So when there was the civil war in Israel, when 2 of the tribes remained in the south in Jerusalem, and then the other 10 went to the north, right? The south was often called Judah or Jerusalem. And the people in the north were called Israel or Samaria, because that was the capital, or it was called Ephraim, right? Or Ephraim and Manasseh. Right? Bible trivia question. I already asked the altar servers before Mass, so they can't answer this. But who was Ephraim's father? Joseph, right? Man, Mark Washer, he is on top of it, man. Yeah. A little silent round of applause there, I think is very worthy, right? Yeah, so Ephraim was the son of Joseph, right? This is actually one of the reasons why, during the Civil War, why there was a split. It's because Jacob, right, whose name was changed to Israel, he had his 12 sons, and at the end of his life, he gave the blessing to his sons. And it's kind of confusing. You can read about it in Genesis chapter 49. Basically, he gives the firstborn blessing to Judah, right? But then he also gave a very special blessing to Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So when the Civil War broke out centuries later, the ones who went to the north, they often said, right, that they had received the true blessing of Jacob. Right? So the family issues that Jacob had in his life carried on in his descendants. Okay? But St. Ephrem is not the Ephraim of the Bible. St. Ephrem was a deacon who lived in the 4th century in Syria. St. Ephrem is kind of interesting. He's not one of the more influential of the doctors of the church, but he is a doctor of the church, and he's one that I actually am very fond of. One of the things that makes St. Ephrem unique among other church fathers is that he wrote in Syriac. So most of the church fathers who we think of, people like Irenaeus and Augustine and Justin Martyr and Ignatius of Antioch, etc., right? Almost all of them, they either wrote in Greek or in Latin. Ephrem wrote in Syriac. If you know anything about the Syriac language, Syriac was basically a more modernized version of ancient Hebrew. You guys know that the Hebrew that is spoken in Israel today, right, is very different from the ancient Hebrew that the Bible was written in. Syriac is basically one of the languages along those stages of evolution. Now, the reason why this is significant, in my opinion, is that when you read the church fathers, because they were used to writing in Latin and Greek, they didn't read the Bible in its original language, at least not in the Old Testament. And many of them, when they talked about theology, they had a very Gentile perspective of theology. Ephrem, because he was steeped in those ancient languages, because he himself wrote in Syriac, I would argue that he was much more in touch with the Jewishness of Christianity than most other church fathers. So there's some very interesting things that he writes. For example, he has some hymns that he wrote and some poetry where he writes about Adam and Eve in the garden. And he describes Adam as wearing vestments and swinging a thurible. He describes Adam as a priest. When you read the Old Testament in its original Hebrew, right, you can kind of get this. It's kind of implicitly stated in various parts of the Old Testament, that Adam himself was a priest. But if you're reading everything in translation or you're having a Gentile perspective, you kind of miss some of those hints. So it's really interesting when you read St. Ephrem, you can see the Jewishness of Christianity a lot more clearly coming out in his writings. Probably the reason why he's not very influential is because of that fact that he was writing in Syriac. So there's not as many scholars who are fluent or able to read Syriac. So he's not as influential or as known, but I think he's a very fascinating theologian. Also, he was interesting because, again, not only did he preach and write, but he loved poetry and music. So a number of things that he wrote were poems and hymns, putting theology in the form of music and poetry. Dante, in his Divine Comedy, was actually heavily influenced by St. Ephrem and some of the images that he wrote about in his poetry and his hymns. So there's a number of interesting things about St. Ephrem. So if you're looking for somebody for some spiritual reading, or you want to start reading some of the church fathers, I think St. Ephrem is a great person to start with.